For years, we watched divorces happen on paper. Marriages ended, houses were sold, rings came off. But episode 11 proves something far more final. This was not a legal divorce. This wasn't even a breakup. This was the moment the Brown family emotionally walked away from Kody Brown together. No yelling, no explosive argument, no dramatic exit, just silence, distance, and a man who now realizes far too late that to this family he once controlled no longer is family at all. And once emotional divorce happens, there is no reconciliation coming back from that. Crew, before I go deeper, tell me down in the comments, did you feel it too, that quiet finality in episode 11? Legal divorce is an issue of paperwork. Emotional divorce is an acceptance. And episode 11 does not scream chaos. It speaks to closure. Here, no doors are being slammed shut. No explosive shouting. No threats. Instead, there's something far more terminal. Silence. This episode unveiled a family that had already processed the emotional details elsewhere in their lives. What we watch now isn't the breakup, it's the aftermath. The part where emotions have already settled, decisions have already been made, and the heart has moved on with quiet deliberation. No one struggles to make someone understand them anymore. Nobody is begging Kody to change. No one is begging for sympathy. And that fact matters more than any argument ever could. Because people only explain their pain when they believe the other person still has the capacity or the willingness to understand it. Explaining pain is an act of hope. It's emotional investment. In episode 11, all that hope is gone. The wives, and more importantly, the children stop trying. That's the difference. It is here where the viewers have always gotten it wrong. Silence doesn't mean peace. Silence doesn't mean forgiveness. It means the internal decision has already been made. When people stop arguing, that is not because things got better. It means they've already left emotionally. Kody, however, is still speaking from an earlier chapter. He speaks as if conversations are going on, as if reconciliation is still possible, as if the family is still negotiating emotional terms. Yet, the family has moved past conversation into detachment. And detachment is not coldness. Rather, it's one form of protection applied to the self. Another way that psychologists describe emotional divorce is when disappointment replaces the anger in a person. Anger is loud, reactive, and desperate for change. Disappointment is quiet, composed, and done hoping. Everywhere, disappointment is reflected in episode 11. It is calm in terms of body language. Answers are measured. The emotional urgency is gone. And that is why this episode is uncomfortable to watch. Because we're not seeing heartbreak in real time. We're seeing the acceptance after. That acceptance did not occur overnight. It was built across years of unmet needs, broken trust, and emotional invalidation. For every feeling dismissed, for every responsibility deflected, for every moment when loyalty was demanded instead of being earned. By episode 11, the emotional bank account is empty. There are no overdrafts left, no emergency credit, no emotional goodwill. What remains is clarity of the emotions. And emotional clarity is terrifying for someone like Kody, because clarity doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't try to convince. That's all it does is move on. Kody still talks his way through this, acting as if he is misunderstood and that the problem can be reduced to one of communication. But episode 11 reveals something more profound. Communication isn't failing. It's no longer necessary. The family has now stopped trying to change him. They're rearranging their lives around the fact that nothing has changed. That's emotional divorce. It is that moment when people stop asking, how do we fix this? And then, how can I safeguard against this? And once that replaces the first question, the relationship is already over. What makes episode 11 so powerful is its restraint. TLC doesn't dramatize this moment, because real emotional endings rarely look dramatic. They look calm, settled, final, and that's precisely what we are seeing. Bitterness, not anger, but emotional resignation. The kind that doesn't come back. Bold retention line. Anger wants change. Disappointment expects nothing. And in episode 11, the Brown family is no longer angry. They're done expecting. Episode 11 quietly confirms something devastating. The children aren't waiting for Kody anymore. Not waiting for an apology. Not waiting for clarity. Not waiting on efforts. And that silence speaks louder than any argument we've ever seen on Sister Wives. There's no pleading anymore. No hopeful pauses in their voices. No bargaining with emotions masquerading as conversation. Instead, they speak to clarification, not pain. That is a distinction that matters. Pain sounds desperate. Pain wants to be seen. Pain still hopes for repair. Clarity doesn't. Clarity implies that the emotional verdict has already been passed. This is emotional adulthood. For years, Kody positioned himself as the authority figure, the center of the family system. Decisions, validation, and emotional direction all flowed through him. Love was conditional. Loyalty was expected. Obedience was confused for respect. But something unprecedented unfolds in episode 11. The children have quietly stepped out of that system. They are not rebelling. They are not lashing out. They aren't even confronting him. They're just operating without him. And that's the real rupture. What this episode reflects is the children emotionally parenting themselves, setting boundaries, managing expectations, and regulating their emotions without their father. That's not immaturity. That means survival. They no longer expect safety from him. They no longer expect leadership from him. They no longer expect emotional availability from him. And when children stop expecting those things from a parent, something irreparable has already occurred. For expectation is the last thread of relation. Once the expectation is gone, the relationship doesn't collapse, it just fades. It is described by psychologists as emotional cutoff, the moment when a child makes the internal decision that a parent is incapable of meeting his or her emotional needs and refuses to continue to invest in that parent for emotional fulfillment. It's full of those moments in episode 11. Let us proceed with the calm tone, the matter-of-fact language, the lack of escalation on an emotional level. These are not children who are trying to be heard. These are adults who already listened and stopped expecting change. And here's the part that's hardest for Kody to understand. He is not being rejected. He goes free. Rejection is emotional. Fixed release. The rejection says, "You hurt me." Release says, "I'm done needing you." And a release is colder than a rejection because it removes emotional leverage. Nothing is left for negotiation. Devastating. For someone like Kody, whose authority came through emotional dependence, authority only works when people still believe the authority figure is necessary. Episode 11 proves them wrong on that count. They don't argue with him. They don't run after his approval. They don't try to correct his narrative. The children have emotionally grown up, outgrowing him, and they do not survive being outgrown either. It is at this point that an emotional divorce becomes irreversible. She was taken aback because reconciliation does require two people who still want the repair. Episode 11, on the other hand, shows that on one side, the desire is gone. The kids are not hostile. They are not cruel. They are not melodramatic. They're neutral. Neutrality is the emotional end. Bold retention line. You can argue with someone who still needs you, but you don't argue with someone you've outgrown. That line defines episode 11. Kody is still being overly emotional, arguing his case. The children aren't. And when one side stops fighting, the relationship has long ended whether anyone wants to admit it or not. This isn't a phase. This isn't distance. This is closure. And closure doesn't reopen. Notice something important in episode 11. Christine doesn't look angry. Janelle doesn't seem that heartbroken. They look settled. And that detail changes everything. It's not emotional numbness. This is suppression. This is no surprise. This is completion. Viewers often expect grief to look loud tears, shaking voices, visible anguish. But grief doesn't live there forever. Once it's been processed, something quieter replaces it. Acceptance. Christine reached that stage seasons ago. Her heartbreak unfolded off screen. And over time, through disappointment, loneliness, repeated emotional invalidation. Of course, she had already left emotionally by the time she left physically. Episode 11 confirms that Christine is no longer processing pain. She's at peace. That's not bitterness. That's emotional resolution. Janelle's road was another matter, but the destination is the same. She grieved alone, in private. She did not dramatize her pain. She didn't emotionally put herself in the center. She internalized, reevaluated, and slowly withdrew. Episode 11 shows the result of that quiet process. Janelle's not responding. She's being grounded. And grounded people are impossible to control. This episode doesn't find either woman acting out of emotional dependence. Neither is looking for anyone's validation. Neither is correcting Kody's version of events. Neither is emotionally attached to his approval or disapproval. They have already decentered him. That's terrifying for someone who survives on control. Control doesn't require anger. Control requires access. Access to emotions. Access to guilt, hope accessed. Episode 11 reveals that access has been denied. Christine and Janelle aren't responding to Kody. They're responding to themselves. Their body language is measured. Their words are measured. Their emotional tone is self-directed. That's not passive. That's powerful. Because control only works on people who are still emotionally invested in. Once that investment disappears, then authority collapses. This is why episode 11 feels so much like a nightmare. There is no confrontation because confrontation would mean unfinished business. There is no pleading. Where there is pleading, there is emotional dependence. There are no visible or overt signs of grief, since the grief has already been acknowledged and, in fact, released. Instead, one finds emotional clarity, and emotional clarity doesn't ask for permission. Kody just tries to consistently paint himself as the injured party, but episode 11 peels away the weak link in that contention. You cannot hurt those who no longer give you access to their inner world. Christine and Janelle are soft. They aren't resentful. They aren't cold. They're complete. Completion is the final stage of emotional separation. This is the moment when the dynamics of control completely break down. Not when someone fights back, but when they stop engaging altogether. The most dangerous moment for a controlling person is when their victims stop reacting. That's what episode 11 captures. Christine and Janelle aren't reacting anymore. They've moved past survival mode, past explanation, past justification. They're living from self-trust, and self-trust doesn't negotiate with control. This session quietly confirms what the entire season's been building toward. Kody hasn't lost arguments. A has lost relevance. When relevance is lost, for one reason or another, authority never returns. This is the most uncomfortable part of episode 11. Not because of what is said, but because of what finally lands. Kody can feel it. Not intellectually, logically not, but emotionally. For the first time, he feels the distance. There's no sense of urgency in the room. Not one tugging emotion to bring them back to him. No need to redeem yourself immediately. And then, it hits. His anger doesn't land. In past seasons, anger inspired responses. It elicited responses. It was compelling, and it forced the issue. But episode 11 strips that power away. Nobody hastens to reassure him. None jump in to clarify intentions. None of them attempt to manage his feelings. Because the emotional divorce has already occurred, what Kody is experiencing isn't rebellion, it's absence, lack of emotional access. And absence is devastating for someone who built authority on emotional dependence. Kody just keeps reframing himself as misunderstood. He speaks as if clarity would restore connection, as if the right explanation might still pull the family back into orbit. But episode 11 reveals the more profound fact. He wasn't some misunderstood lad. He was abandoned emotionally a long time ago. And abandonment feels heartbreakingly unfair when you believe authority should promise loyalty in return. Kody was raised on a principle that seemed to say being the head of the family means emotional priority, that loyalty is owed, not earned, that questioning his behavior is betrayal, not communication. Episode 11 quietly disassembles that assumption, because loyalty without connection is unsustainable. Connection requires responsiveness, responsibility, fix, and those things had been missing far too long. What makes this episode so uncomfortable is watching Kody arrive emotionally at a moment the rest of the family reached years earlier. He's late. Late to accountability, late to empathy, late to mend, and timing is everything. Emotionally. You can't show up to emotional conversations after the fact, when people have moved on. By the time Kody starts feeling the loss, his family has already embraced the fact of losing a loved one. That's why his reactions seem so disjointed. He's mourning the loss of clout. They're living in peace without it. That is the source of tension behind episode 11. Kody's expressions, confusion, frustration, disbelief, reveal a man in the process of coming to a disconcerting recognition that the rules he has lived with are irrelevant. Fear no longer operates. Authority no longer convinces. Emotion no longer bends, because it only works when people still believe they need you. Episode 11 proves they don't. The lack of emotional repair is striking. Nobody intervenes to diffuse his emotion. Nobody takes care to make him feel better. Not because he is cruel, but because he is detached. Detachment is not punishment, it's self-preservation. That's the final stage of emotional divorce. The tragedy of Kody isn't that he lost his family in episode 11. It's that he's realizing it after the loss is complete. There's no dramatic exit left to stop. Apology left that hasn't expired. Without the right, that is to say, authority left to them to reclaim. Only the quiet realization that emotional power, once lost, doesn't regenerate. Authority without connection collapses the moment fear stops working. Episode 11 captures that collapse in real time. And it's not loud, it's slow, it's awkward, it's irreversible. Episode 11 doesn't let Sister Wives end on a high note without drama. It begins with denial and ends it with acceptance. There are no explosive confrontations, no ultimatums at the last minute, no diving off the emotional cliffs. Instead, there is something much more concrete. Finality. The family is no longer waiting for changes in Kody. They don't plan conversations based on his responses anymore. They no longer emotionally place him at the center of their lives. And that's the real divorce. Not paperwork, not separation announcements, rather jargon than legal language. Emotional moving. This isn't a pause, not tension. This isn't space. This is closure. That's what we mean by closure, people. Stop saying, what if, and start living like it's already done. And we can see episode 11 has that feeling quite clearly now. The family isn't planning around repair, they're planning around stability. The axis is no longer Kody, which means reconciliation no longer counts. Here's the harsh truth. Episode 11 conveys along in whispers. Kody did not lose his wives first. He lost emotional relevance. Relevance is what keeps people showing up even when things are broken. It is the belief that someone still matters enough to be disappointed in. When relevance is gone, disappointment then subsides, and along with it, the urge to repair anything. That's why episode 11 feels calm instead of chaotic. It is calm after one surrenders, not to surrender to a man, but to surrender before reality. And reality, in this case, is that the family has already built a future which doesn't include emotional dependence on Kody Brown. That's not bitterness, that's growth. The wives aren't taking back power. They're taking back peace. The children are not being defiant. They are defending themselves. And Kody isn't getting punished. He's getting bypassed. That's the last stage of emotional divorce. Because an emotional ending does not need consensus. They need to be accepted. And acceptance doesn't ask for permission. This event cannot be undone or compromised. For indeed, no one is waiting anymore. Waiting is where hope lives. Episode 11 shows that hope has moved on. Reconciliation is not an impossibility. It is not necessary. For it is only important that there be reconciliation when people still feel incomplete without it. This family doesn't. The emotional chapter of Sister Wives closes not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding that the story has changed. Not about polygamy, not on marriage, but about accountability. Accountability, too, arrived too late. Crew, last question for you. And it's one that counts. Do you think Kody even realizes the emotional divorce is already over? Or is he still fighting a marriage that no longer exists? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Much love. Until next time.